Okay, folks, let's go ahead and get started here. So, we are moving into the third and final section of this unit. The first one was the aftermath of Napoleon talking about the Concert of Vienna, the Congress of Vienna, the Concert of Europe, rather. And then we moved into talking about the liberal, national, romantic movement of the revolutions of 1848. And now we're moving into the age of realpolitik, which is going to be made up of a few different things. We're going to be talking today, just going to preview this on this slide here. We're talking today about the Second French Empire and the Crimean War. When we come back on Wednesday, we'll get into German and Italian unification. And we'll talk about also the Austro-Hungarian Empire during this unit and others. But we're going to start today by talking about the major theme of this unit, which is that the failures of the revolutions of 1848 led to a new age of politics governed by ruthlessly practical leaders who achieved their goals incrementally and efficiently. Very stark contrast comparative to the previous era of the overly romanticized and idealized movements of the revolutions of 1848, which largely turned out to be unsuccessful due to disagreements between different segments of the population and lack of planning, and then of course conservative reactionism from the powers, the European powers, the imperial powers of Europe. So this new type of politics is exemplified in three people we're going to be talking to a great extent about. Today we're going to be talking about Napoleon III in France. We'll also be talking about Count Cavour in Italy and Otto von Bismarck in Germany. And each of these guys are going to use this idea of real politics. And just in order to introduce this, I always play this clip when I start off talking about the age of realpolitik because it just nicely summarizes kind of where we're going here. Why don't you watch, I'm just going to give you a few minutes here to watch this clip right here. I'm not able to play it for you on my screen, otherwise I'll get blocked or warned or tagged or whatever by YouTube. But go ahead and watch that. I'm going to give you a couple minutes. Watch that right now. Okay, so hopefully you had a chance to watch that. Um, that clip right there is from a movie. It's an old movie. It's from the late 80s. It's called The Remains of the Day. And in that movie, Anthony Hopkins is like the main character. He plays a butler for a British noble estate. And now I must tell you just off the top is that clip, actually the setting of that movie is in the early 1930s. Okay, so it's not in the same era that we're talking about right now. Historically, it comes a little bit past where we are in the years between World War I and World War II, leading up to the Second World War. But what Christopher Reeves, the tall gentleman who plays the American senator in the movie, says in that clip is that the last thing Europe needs right now is noble gentlemen coming together with their spirit of goodwill about days gone by. He says that what they need is professional politicians to handle their affairs, or that they're headed for disaster. And he says that Europe is in the age of real politics, okay? Professional politicians, cunning, thoughtful, backstabbing politicians. And that they need to realize that sooner than later, because Hitler was one of these guys, and they're headed for a Second World War. And he kind of slams them all and gives them a toast at the end of his speech, which of course is extremely offensive. But the point remains that this era that he is referring to, the age of real politics, goes back to what we are learning about right now, which is in the 1850s all the way up until the 1880s, Europe goes through a transition where we see conservative politicians in power making liberal-style reforms in the name of keeping their power. It is a new brand of conservatism. It's not going to be the same kind of conservatism that Europeans had seen in the age of Romanticism, the age of Metternich, and all of those kinds of things. This is going to be a new brand of conservatism where conservative politicians have deliberate, defined political goals that they are going to use pragmatic, practical means to achieve, incrementally, meaning bit by bit. So, talking about this a little bit more, picking up where we left off last class about the failures of the revolutions of 1848, you may remember that I talked about the Frankfurt Parliament and how the nationalists and liberals of the Frankfurt Parliament failed to gain the support of Prussian King Frederick William IV for a constitutional monarchy and a unified Germany. Because when he was presented with the outcome of the Frankfurt Parliament, this paper constitution that they had contrived, he basically says, I refuse to accept a crown from the gutter, and instead claims the old school divine right as what gives him his legitimate authority to rule. This became known as the humiliation of Olmütz. Initially, Frederick William IV had proposed a plan for a German unity, and Frederick William refused to accept that crown for the gutter. And the other part about this was that there were several plans in place for German unity, okay? Remember that Austria has a lot of Austrian Germans, all right? And so for a long time, the question about German unity really was contingent on whether or not Austria would become a part of the German Empire. And if so, who would take the lead? Would it be Austria? Prussia certainly wouldn't have been okay with that. Would it have been Prussia? Austria wouldn't have been okay with that. So there were some stumbling blocks obstacles to German unity because of whether or not Austrian Germans would be included for a plan for a unified Germany. The two plans were known as the Grossdeutsch Plan. The Grossdeutsch Plan would have included Austria. The Kleindeutsch Plan, which ultimately is the plan that Prussia puts into execution, is the one that they go with, which is creating a unified German empire, leaving out Austria and having Austria be their own separate entity. And so these kinds of obstacles served as stumbling blocks to German unity in the revolutions of 1848. But then enter Bismarck in Prussia, and here's a photo of him, or not a photo, but a painting of him in 1862. Otto von Bismarck is the undisputed champion of European political chess during this time. He is a masterful, brilliant politician, extremely cunning tactics used by Otto von Bismarck in terms of war, in terms of reform, and in terms of nationalism, which increasingly in the era of realpolitik, which we're talking about, nationalism starts increasingly to become married to the idea of this new form, new brand of political conservatism. Whereas in the previous era, the age of Romanticism, nationalism had very much been tied to liberalism. As we enter into this new era of realpolitik, nationalism is going to be wielded by these new conservative politicians like Bismarck as a way of bringing the entire nation under their wing. So he defies parliament over taxes, and his plan is to use blood and iron. And this is a quote from Bismarck. Blood and iron is famously the thing that the two-word phrase or three-word phrase that we use to associate with Bismarck's political tactics. It is true that we can hardly escape complications in Germany, although we do not seek them. Germany does not look to Prussia's liberalism, but to her power. The South German states, Bavaria, Württemberg, and Baden, would like to indulge in liberalism, and because of that, no one will assign Prussia's role to them. Prussia must collect her forces and hold them in reserve for an opportune moment, which has already come and gone several times. Since the Treaty of Vienna, our frontiers have not been favorably designed for a healthy body politic. He's talking about unification. But not by speeches in majorities will the great questions of the day be decided. That was the mistake of 1848 and 49. But by iron and blood. And so he's talking about using militarism, using nationalism, using industrialization and reform in industry as a means for Prussia to take the lead in German unification. Italy. Just to give you a little preview on Italy, Austrian forces were for a temporary period of time driven out of northern Italy, while French forces were removed from southern Italy where they occupied Italian territories. Thanks to the short-lived Romantic revolution of Giuseppe Mazzini with the protection of Giuseppe Garibaldi in southern Italy in Naples, in the revolutions of 1848, 1849. And Mazzini had established that brief Roman Republic that ultimately failed when both Austria and France worked together effectively to forcefully take back control over those Italian regions, preventing Italy and ultimately Mazzini from being the hero of Italian unification during the revolutionary Romantic age. And so that's kind of the story on Italy and their failures of the revolutions of 1848. And then, of course, we talked about Austria as well, where we talked about the Hungarian forces led by Louis Kossuth went to war against Austria and even penetrated to the very gates of Vienna. But the Austrian army bounced back with the help of ethnic minorities as well as the Russians in the empire and defeated the Hungarians and preserved the Austrian Empire all the way up until the Compromise of 1867, when Austria was defeated by the Prussians in the Austro-Prussian War, and the Hungarians negotiated a dual monarchy with Austria so that it would now be known as Austria-Hungary afterwards. And then France, we talked about the revolutions of France. Remember that the February Revolution of 1848 had resulted in the overthrow of King Louis Philippe and the new establishment of the Second French Republic, led by Alphonse Lamartine. They went through some growing pains in the June days when there was a far-left revolution in Paris that pitted the bourgeoisie against the working class and conservatives who supported the army, were supported by the army. And they restored order under the direction of General Cavaignac, who we talked about last week. Louis Napoleon became the president. He ran on a very conservative platform, and he was elected president overwhelmingly, and likely he played on the successes of the original Napoleon Bonaparte going back to the beginning of the 19th century. The emergence of realpolitik after 1848. These failures of the revolutions of 1848 for liberals and romantics demonstrated that strong idealism was just not enough to accomplish these revolutionary goals. They needed more practical, more planned out, more pragmatic goals. And the people who would put these goals into effect would be the new brand of conservative politicians in various places across Europe. The age of realism replaced romanticism as the dominant philosophy, and this extended into literature, it extended into art, and it extended into politics. So realpolitik is an outward branch of realism extending into the European political scheme at this time. Political outgrowth of realism was the notion of realpolitik, the accomplishing of one's political goals via practical means rather than having idealism or radicalism drive the political decision making. A new political era emerged where nationalist goals were now going to be married and allied to the conservative goals of the politicians, which would be achieved in a step-by-step Machiavellian fashion. Remember, Machiavelli was the writer of The Prince, which we learned about in the very first unit of the class. Remember how Machiavelli had written in The Prince about how a proper leader of Italy should rule, using cunning, backstabbing techniques, fear. Better to be feared than loved was another famous line from Machiavelli. There were a number of very modern political ideas that were expressed by Machiavelli in The Prince that start to be put into effect in the age of realpolitik. And so German unification, Italian unification, Hungarian autonomy, each of these things happened thanks to this new conservative, nationalist, realpolitik agenda of the various political leaders in those places. In France, of course, you had Emperor Napoleon III, aka Louis Napoleon, who would have to cater to liberals in order to effectively maintain control in France. Now, the first time that we see a failure of the concert of Europe and European nations digress back into war of any sizable magnitude was the Crimean War. And the Crimean War lasts from 1853 to 56. It may have lasted longer if something else hadn't happened, but nonetheless, I'll talk about what happens in a little bit here. But the Crimean War is still relatively short-lived, but it does ultimately pull in a number of European nations into the largest conflict that European nations had been involved with going back to Napoleon. So, I mean, nonetheless, the concert of Europe had managed to maintain peace for about 30 or 40 years, but the concert of Europe ultimately fails when the Crimean War breaks out. Its credibility was undermined by the failure of the great powers of Britain, France, Prussia, Austria, and Russia to cooperate during the revolutions of 1848-49. So between 1848 and 1878, peace in Europe is interrupted by the two larger conflicts, the Crimean War and the Russo-Turkish War of 1877 and 1878, as well as a couple of extremely isolated surgical scalpel kind of conflicts led by Prussia under Otto von Bismarck, who waged war in an isolated fashion against Denmark, Austria, and France without making them into full-scale continental wars. So let's talk about the Crimean War. Another interesting thing to note about the Crimean War is it's the first war in our class and in European history that was photographed. So if we look up Crimean War photos, it's actually extremely interesting to look back, I think, at least. Maybe you guys will think it's boring, but I think it's really interesting to look at old photos, particularly in the early days of photography. Interesting fact for you is that in the 19th century, if you were to add up every single photograph taken in the 19th century, all right, that number would be beaten by the number of pictures taken globally in the last 2 minutes. Okay? I want you to consider that for a second. If you added every single photograph of the 19th century together, that number would be less than the number of pictures taken globally in the last 2 minutes. Okay? That just goes to show you how photography has changed over time. But I do think it's interesting to look at some of these pictures from the Crimean War to give you just an idea of how different wars looked back in the mid-1800s. So here you can see battle happening between soldiers. Here is General Pierre Bosquet of France giving orders to his men. Here's Sergeant J. Breeze of Britain's 11th Hussars, who lost his arm. Here's British and French soldiers relax and share a drink during the Crimean War in 1855. Here you can see soldiers involved in the taking of Malakoff in 1855. This is Florence Nightingale. She's very important because she famously modernized battlefield nursing. We'll talk about her and her light brigade today a little bit. Officers of Britain's 71st Highlanders. Here are soldiers, British soldiers who lost their limbs in the war, and you can see early prosthetics here. This guy holding a prosthetic leg. This is ruins of a Russian post used to defend Sevastopol, very similar to trench warfare that made up World War I. You can see here Major Hallowell of Britain lounges about while a servant pours him a drink. Very interesting, I always think, to look back at old school photographs of not only the Crimean War, but just in general, old school photos are always really interesting. Here's the photographer's van. That I thought was kind of cool too. But so you can see here, and we won't go through all of them, but pretty cool stuff. All right, so how does the Crimean War start? What happens? Why do they go to war? What is the Crimean War? Well, the major cause of the war is a dispute between two groups of Christians over privileges in the Holy Land, an area today known as Palestine. All right, and Palestine now resides in the regions of Israel, but at the time it was controlled by the Ottoman Empire. And in 1852, the Turks of the Ottoman Empire, who controlled Palestine at the time, agreed to demand by Napoleon III leader of France, Emperor of France, to provide enclaves in the Holy Land for the protection of Roman Catholic religious orders. And the reason that he did this is because Napoleon III was trying to curry favor with conservative religious groups in the Catholic Church at this time in 1852. This is right after he runs his coup and takes over as Emperor of France. So he's still trying to cater to the conservative powers in France, such as institutions like the church and the military, in order to secure his legitimacy as the Emperor of France. And the Turks, which had, going back for centuries, had a relatively benevolent relationship with the French. Many times the Turks and the French had allied with each other, fighting against the Ottomans in the 15, 16, and 1700s. The Turks agreed to Napoleon III's demands. Russia, on the other hand, became immediately concerned with this because this agreement between the Turks and the French seemed to jeopardize an existing agreement that the Turks had with the Russians. In particular, Russian protection of Eastern Orthodox interests in the Holy Land. And so, as a result of that, the Russians basically say, you are giving preference to Roman Catholics in an area that has been given exclusive rights to Eastern Orthodox worshipers. Meanwhile, the hidden agenda that Russia has at this time is that, as you may well know, the Ottoman Empire was already nicknamed the sick man of Europe at this time. Russia, having most of its ports located in either extremely distant areas or in areas where the waters are likely to freeze over in the wintertime, Russia had been for a long time looking to get access to the Mediterranean Sea for trade. And this opportunity presents itself to the Tsar of Russia, Nicholas I at the time. And Nicholas I says, not only are we executing our duty to protect Greek Orthodox interests, Eastern Orthodox religious rights in the Holy Land, this is also an opportunity for us to increase our control in Ottoman territories along the Danube River. And so Tsar Nicholas I ordered Russian troops to occupy several Turkish-controlled provinces along the Danube River. They are literally invading the Ottoman Empire. And Russia said, we're only doing this temporarily. Once you guarantee rights for Orthodox Christians, we will remove our forces. That's what they say, at least. This isn't going to settle well, though, with the French or the British, who view this as extremely hostile and a military land grab so that Russia can increase its influence in the Balkans, where the Danube River flows. So the Turks declare war on Russia because, of course, Russia has invaded their provinces, when Nicholas I refuses to withdraw his troops until rights are guaranteed to Eastern Orthodox Christians in the Holy Land. In 1854, Britain and France, unusually because both Britain and France are Christian, and the Ottoman Turks were Muslim largely, they decide to ally with the Ottoman Empire against the Russians, who are Christian. So this is interesting because remember, the Concert of Europe was all about, you know, the Christian alliance, right? And Christian powers working together to put down liberalism and stuff like that. But here we see a fragmenting of that, where Christian British and French troops are going to be fighting against Eastern Orthodox Christian troops from Russia, excuse me, from Russia. All right, and allying, the British and French allying themselves with the Ottoman Turks. From the beginning, they had several goals. Here's a few of them for you, but they had several goals in this conflict. Russia had to renounce their claims to the occupied principalities along the Danube that they had invaded. That was one of their goals. Another of the goal of the British and French getting involved in this was the navigation in the mouth of the Danube River, where the Black Sea is, had to be internationalized. Russia wasn't going to be able to allow to dominate that. And then Russia had to renounce its special role of Greek Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, meaning they were no longer supposed to be the guardians of Greek Orthodox Christians within the Ottoman Empire, because those aren't their lands anyway. So these are some of the goals that the British and the French had to achieve in this conflict, the Crimean War. In 1855, the Italian state of Sardinia-Piedmont joined in the war against Russia, and then Austria also agrees to the British and French 4 points and gave Russia an ultimatum to comply with the 4 points, or Austria would join the war as well. So here's what's interesting, is that the war probably would have gone on longer, but Nicholas I, who was the one who started this whole debacle, ends up dying in 1855. And his successor, the new Tsar, Alexander II, immediately agreed to accept the 4 points, because unlike his predecessor, Alexander II was opposed to continuing the war and felt that there was nothing to be gained from engaging in a giant conflict with the British, French, Austrians, and Italians by continuing to resist these 4 points that had been laid out. So, in terms of the actual fighting of the war, most of the war was fought on this peninsula, which is the Crimean Peninsula in the Black Sea. The Danube River runs over here. Okay, and you can see that if Russia had completely gained access to the Danube River in some of these areas here, it would have given them a significant trade opportunity to dominate the trade of the mouth of the Danube River, as well as much of the Black Sea. And the French and British powers, as well as the Ottomans, don't want to see that happen. So most of the war was fought on the Crimean Peninsula. You might know of Crimea before, because it was in the news towards the end of Obama's presidency, maybe around 2014 or 15. The Russians, in modern day times, annexed Crimea and basically took it over. And you might think, well, wasn't Crimea already part of Russia? Well, at this time it was. Back in the 1850s, Crimea was part of Russia. But since then, Ukraine became an independent state. And so Ukraine is a sovereign nation, and Crimea is technically part of Ukraine. But the international powers that be didn't stand in Russia's way in taking over Crimea, in part because a lot of the people that live on the Crimean Peninsula do, from a national ethnic level, identify as Russian rather than Ukrainian, and people don't want to go to war with Russia over Crimea. So the United States, Britain, France, they don't get involved when Russia annexes Crimea and essentially takes it over, but it was nonetheless concerning and viewed very much as a power grab by Russian leader Vladimir Putin. Over 50,000 British and French troops fought against the Russian forces in the Crimean War, seeking to take over the Black Sea port city of Sevastopol. And during the war, Florence Nightingale, who lived from 1820 to 1910, made a significant name for herself as a British nurse who became a pioneer in modern nursing, particularly tending to battlefields in medical camps along the front lines, or just behind the front lines of the Crimean War. Now, during the Crimean War, more people were actually dying of disease than by combat wounds. That may be as a result of better medical treatment when people became wounded, and preventing infections and amputations and things like that. But many people still continue dying of disease because they don't have simple things like antibiotics and stuff at this time. Medical technology is still extremely primitive all the way through the 19th century, the 1800s. But Nightingale's Light Brigade superbly tended to wounded men during the war, even though the fatalities due to disease remained very high. And then once the war comes to an end, after Alexander II agrees to the 4 points, Russia really emerges as the big loser in this conflict. Russia no longer had control of maritime trade along the Danube. They now had to recognize Turkish control of the mouth of the Danube, and they had to renounce their claims to Moldavia and Wallachia, which later became the sovereign nation of Romania. Russia also renounced their role as protector of Greek Orthodoxy in the Ottoman Empire, and that was one of the 4 points. And then Russia also agreed to return all occupied territories along the Danube back to the Ottoman Empire, and the Black Sea was made neutral, where internationally all nations were able to trade in the Black Sea. And then finally, independence and integrity of the Ottoman Empire was recognized and guaranteed for the last 70 years of its existence, all the way up until the end of World War I in 1918. So, aftermath of the Crimean War, Russia walks away from the Crimean War as the big loser, and doubly so, they were shocked that they had fallen behind militarily and industrially so far, comparatively to, say, the British and the French. And so it's in the later 1800s, 1870s, 1880s, all the way really until the 1920s, 1930s, that Russia began its move towards industrialization and modernization of its army. However, significant obstacles will be in place in those respects due to the fact that Russia remained a highly autocratic, despotic, absolutist-oriented state that was absolutely unwilling to pass reforms in the name of liberalism and stuff like that, under the rule of the Tsar, who operated as basically a god amongst men. So Russia, and the other thing too that prevents Russia from industrializing as quickly, you have to remember Russia is a massive land territory. It's going to be occupied largely by huge rural populations, and they're not going to have that same kind of national spirit, and also too just isolation and tight-knit characterization of, say, the British, because the British Isles are very small. They're islands. They're isolated. It made it easier for rural populations to begin urbanizing and moving to industrial urban centers and seeking out wage labor type work and stuff like that. The same kind of changes are going to take a lot longer in Russia, because just so much of the population is so rural. They live in extremely distant reaches of the empire. To build a railroad across England, you're talking about a few hundred miles. To build one across Russia, you're talking about several thousand miles. It's going to be just much harder for Russia to get on board with modernization and industrialization, particularly because of how autocratic the rule and the style of government is there. Jumping back over to France and the Second French Republic, which existed from 1848 to 1852. Under the new Second French Republic, led by Alphonse Lamartine back in the Revolution of 1848, they had created a constitution with a unicameral single-house legislature known as the National Assembly, and then strong executive power, having a strong president, strong executive. Remember that there had been times where they looked to deliberately make the executive branch weak. This was not so in the Second French Republic. The president was very strong in the Second French Republic of France. And then popularity elected the president of the republic. They had universal male suffrage. And as I mentioned to you, in the elections of 1848, President Louis Napoleon defeated General Cavaignac, who had put down the insurrection in Paris in the June days of 1848, and Louis Napoleon became president in 1848, and then Emperor Napoleon III in 1852. Let's talk about his early days, when it was still the Second French Republic days. President Louis Napoleon was seen by voters as a symbol of stability and greatness. He was dedicated to law and order and opposed to socialism and radicalism. And he favored the conservative classes, the church, the army, people who owned property, as well as large businesses in France. And this was what allowed him to gain, the confidence of the French people. Is he catered to these conservative interests in his early political career. And this was, in some sense, exactly an example of realpolitik, because Louis Napoleon, to be honest with you, he really carried a lot of liberal agendas, we'll say, in terms of revolutionizing France and modernizing France and stuff like that. He was okay with reform. President Louis Napoleon, though, had to project an image of staunch conservatism in order to garner favor from the powers and institutions in France that would allow him to be able to make these reforms. And so there was a deliberateness about how President Louis Napoleon ruled. And so voters, of course, your everyday common person, are going to be swayed by just the name Napoleon alone, which went down in French history as, legendary. And so the legend and greatness of and stability of the early Napoleonic days is something that President Louis Napoleon politically definitely used to his advantage, despite his relatively weak relation to the original Napoleon. In return for support of conservatives, Louis Napoleon had to make concessions that he didn't necessarily want to make to these various groups. For example, the church. So this is a great example of realpolitik of Louis Napoleon, because he doesn't want the church having undue control. He doesn't want the church having more control over the French government. He wants the church to be subdued to the interests of the nation state. But in order to gain favor from French Catholics and Roman Catholics and the church in general, he passed something known as the Fallow Laws. The Fallow Laws, and Louis Napoleon, returned control of the education system of France to the church in return for church support. And he also ended up minimizing the influence of the legislative assembly. He supported policies that were favorable to the army, who were also conservative, so that he would have the military's support. He disenfranchised many poor people from voting, because poor people were likely to, especially in urban areas in France, in Paris and so on, urban people were largely radical and even perhaps sympathized with socialism. And so he doesn't want those people having undue influence in the elections. He also destroyed the democratic socialist movement by jailing or exiling leaders of those movements and closing down labor unions to try to keep the population in control. What we will see about Louis, the general characterization that I would use to describe Louis Napoleon's rule of France, and he's the leader of France for a very long time, several decades, and his rule starts off very conservative, very authoritarian, very much catering to the conservative institutional powers that be to reign in control after the revolutions of 1848. But as time goes on, this tight stranglehold that Napoleon III had over the nation starts to loosen, and he starts to pass more liberal reforms domestically in order to cater to those groups who had become very critical of Louis Napoleon's foreign policy. So at home, Louis Napoleon ends up making a lot of liberal concessions, not necessarily because he really wants to, but again because he knows that in order to secure his place at the top of French government, he needs to cater to people that whose support he needs, to minimize the fallout of criticism and so on. So if he can make changes and take credit for making changes, before getting so much criticism from opposing groups to his rule, he gets to take credit for them and undermine, take the wind out of their sails and undermine their causes, because he gets to be the one that says, well, look what I did. I'm the one who completely rebuilt Paris, widened the roads, built canals, built railroads. What have you done? And so through these reforms, he gets to take credit for making these changes while at the same time smoothing over grievances of all of his opposition. Very, very brilliant. Very, very brilliant. Not a stupid man. He supported policies favorable to the army. I talked about all that. Okay. The Legislative Assembly did not grant Louis Napoleon either payment of his large personal debt or allowance for a second presidential term. And when it becomes clear that Louis Napoleon was not going to be able to run for a second term as president, this is where he conceives of his plan to overthrow the Second French Republic and institute the new Second French Empire, under which would be led by him, Emperor Napoleon III. So he plots a coup, very classic Napoleon move, by the way, to plot a coup, take over the government, and then get people to support you after the fact, which is exactly what Napoleon I did back in the coup d'etat Brumaire, when the original Napoleon overthrew the Directory. Well, this new Napoleon, Napoleon III, is going to overthrow the Second French Empire, take control of government in a coup d'etat in December of 1851, right at the end of his first presidential term, and become emperor the following year. And when he becomes emperor, he restored universal suffrage in 1852, and 92% of the people voted to make him president for 10 years. That's amazing, because what he was able to do is basically say, I'm taking over the government, oh, and by the way, I'm instituting universal suffrage. Not because he cares so much about universal suffrage, but because he knew that it would be so overwhelmingly approved by the French population at large that there would be no chance that they wouldn't elect him and vote to make him president for 10 years. And France was the only country in Europe at that time to provide universal suffrage. America doesn't even provide universal suffrage at that point in history. And so in 1853, 97% of voters agreed to another provision to make him a hereditary emperor. So Napoleon is very quickly grabbing his power, consolidating his power, and making it so that it's going to be very difficult for anyone to remove him from his post at the top of the French government. In 1851 to 59, Napoleon III's control, as I said early on, he had a stranglehold over the French government. His control was extremely direct and authoritarian, and he was going about centralizing and strengthening his power. He created an imperial, which is just relating to the word empire, an imperial aristocracy that emerged during his rule that consisted of wealthy businessmen. He was no stranger to censoring the press to prevent bad news stories from getting out, or punishing those who printed bad news stories. And then the government, of course, started to sponsor official candidates who would have been loyal to Napoleon III in various elections while he was emperor. But from 1859 to 1870, in the last 10 or 11 years of his reign, Napoleon III set out to build the liberal empire by initiating a series of reforms that, as I mentioned before, would take the wind out of the sails of all of his opposition. Napoleon III's rule provided a model, meanwhile, for other political leaders in Europe, such as Count Cavour of Italy or Otto von Bismarck of Prussia. And he demonstrated how government could reconcile popular and conservative forces by using authoritarian nationalism. All right? So again, going back to this idea that nationalism, increasingly under the era of real politicians, are going to use nationalism as a force to bind together and control the population rather than to run revolutions or do those kinds of things that it had done in a previous era. Economic reforms in France under Napoleon III resulted in a very healthy economy. Infrastructure such as railroads, canals, and roads, hard paved roads, started to be built. Baron George von Haussmann, a German descent developer, was hired to completely redesign the city of Paris, widen the roads, build new roads, build canals, okay? They completely tear Paris apart during this time and rebuild it to become the modern city that it is today. Also, we see a movement towards free trade in the later years of Louis Napoleon's rule, which again, conservatives previously had not been about free trade. But these new conservatives are going to be passing laws that are more friendly towards liberal economies. So French exports doubled inside of 10 years. He signs a liberal trade treaty with Britain so that trade between Britain and France would have fewer tariffs and trade barriers. And it was perhaps the first time that any modern state had played such a direct role in stimulating the economy. So this is the thing that's so interesting about it is, on one hand, you have the government that is forcing these policies to be passed. That's not very free. That's not very laissez-faire. However, the kinds of policies that they are passing are done with the interest of undermining the liberals who had been critical of, in particular in Louis Napoleon's case, his foreign policy, including imperialism, colonization, as well as the Crimean War, and so on and so forth. Also in France, economically, the Crédit Mobilier funded industrial and infrastructural growth, very similar to the way that in the early days of the Industrial Revolution in Britain, Britain's Parliament and National Bank had been funding entrepreneurial enterprises as well. France's metallurgical industry, iron and steel, started to rival Britain's under Napoleon III. French investors were financing large infrastructural projects outside of France, even in Russia, where they were trying to build the Trans-Siberian Railway. Spain, Italy, places where industrialization hadn't really come into full swing yet. France realizes if we use our own money to fund infrastructural projects in places where industrialization hasn't set in, we can make an absolute killing on it. Also, the Suez Canal in Egypt, which was controlled largely by Britain, to be honest, but the French funded and built the Suez Canal under Napoleon III, and it gets completed in 1869, just before the French lose a significant war against the Prussians, but we'll get to that in a bit here. But the Suez Canal, even though the French built it, really the Suez Canal becomes far more important for the British, because the British begin using the Suez Canal as it literally gets nicknamed the lifeline of the empire, because the British are sailing across the Mediterranean through the Suez Canal, which is near Egypt, and then it connects to the Red Sea, and then from the Red Sea they go down to the Indian Ocean, and they can get to India, which was the most profitable, important colony that Britain had, was India. And so the British were using the Suez Canal, which had been built by the French, all the way through the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and early 1900s. Political reforms under Napoleon III. He extended the power of the Legislative Assembly later on in his reign, and members were elected by universal suffrage every 6 years. Opposition candidates started to have greater freedom later on. Remember, he loosens his grip over time. And he returned the control of the secondary education system back to the government. This is another thing that shows you that Louis Napoleon was a smart dude. Okay, initially he had given control under the Fallow laws over to the Roman Catholic Church in France. However, once it becomes clear that he is the undisputed leader, emperor of France, he goes back on the Falloux laws and reclaims the educational system for the government of France. And of course, the Pope is extremely upset by this, and Pope Pius IX issued a famous document known as the Syllabus of Errors, condemning in particular this policy in France, but also all other liberal policies that any conservative politician from the era of realpolitik was making during this time. In the 1860s, the Pope comes out and absolutely shuns all liberal efforts in European politics at this time. He also permitted trade unions in their right to strike beginning in 1864, again loosening the grip, easing censorship, granting amnesty to political prisoners, supporting projects that created better housing, as well as supporting the creation of private credit unions and the regulation of pawn shops, where people would be able to go and secure personal loans or trade or purchase goods at a pawn shop or those kinds of things. Foreign policy is definitely, though, the Achilles heel of Napoleon III. Napoleon III constantly was having to put out fires in relation to his foreign policies. There was a lot of strong, ardent criticism of Napoleon III's foreign policies. Domestically, he was doing a lot of good for France, but in terms of foreign policy, people were kind of raking him over the coals. So he sent French troops into Italy to rescue and restore Pope Pius IX. This isn't going to settle well with liberals or radicals, and this gets condemned by Republicans in France, even though obviously conservatives in France would have been okay with that, because conservatives tend to be more Christian, more religious. Okay, and so this act gets condemned by Republicans but supported by conservatives and moderates. So he gets some heat from that. The French involvement in the Crimean War, as I mentioned, angered both Republicans and liberals. And when I say that, remember, this has nothing to do with modern-day Republicans and liberals. We're talking about radical Republicans in France and then laissez-faire liberals, classical liberals in France. Although much of Europe saw Napoleon III as the victor in the war, it nonetheless still got him a lot of criticism for being overly militaristic and getting France involved in unnecessary conflicts. The issue of colonialism, in particular in Northern Africa, in Algeria, as well as other colonies in Africa and Indochina and in Latin America, became a contentious political issue with anti-imperialists, which did exist. That might surprise you, but there were people in Europe who were very against European nations going and taking over other places and making them colonies, what is otherwise known as imperialism, so anti-imperialists. And Napoleon III is essentially an imperialist, and he is trying to secure French assets in the form of colonies in various places in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, and it's not going so well. So anti-imperialists come out against him. And Napoleon's liberal reforms, the changes that he makes in terms of allowing people to strike and easing censorship and taking back the education system for the government of France and other things like that, many of them were done as a direct response to so much of the criticism that he had garnered from his foreign policy, from liberals in France. And so he makes these changes probably not because that's really where his heart truly lies, but because he knows that he has to do it in order to undermine any criticism that he has been receiving from them. So, what brings him to an end? The Franco-Prussian War. In 1870-1871, Prussia has already waged two isolated wars against Denmark and Austria. By the time that they get to 1870-1871, Prussia has an interest in waging a remote, isolated war, short-lived war against France to exert their political and military dominance in Europe. So Otto von Bismarck, leader of Prussia, or Chancellor of Prussia at this time, ends up declaring war on France. Actually, he doesn't declare war on France. He gets France to declare war on him and then soundly defeats France. It was very, very, very clever. Remember, I told you Otto von Bismarck was the master of European chess. And France goes to war with Prussia, rather, and they end up getting defeated very, very quickly. And Napoleon III is not only defeated, but also captured by the Prussians in this conflict. And this resulted in the collapse of the Second French Empire and the end of Napoleon III in 1871. And here you can see an image of Napoleon III sitting on the left here next to Otto von Bismarck, Chancellor of Germany, after his defeat and capture. Folks, that brings me to the end of my lecture for today. I want to thank you so much. Have a happy Monday, and we will continue with Italian and German unification on Wednesday morning. Make sure to go on Canvas and get the questions for the reading guide done. Other than that, have a wonderful rest of your day.